I'm cheating a little bit with this because as I said, I find it difficult to talk primarily about the paintings as such, because I really know absolutely nothing about a great number of the participants. So what I'm going to do is to give us a sort of a slight lecture on the beginnings of abstract expressionism, because this is really what it's all about. And the fascinating thing is that it did become international. And one of the most, I mean, as you know, because I'm interested in politics, the thing that interests me most is that the CIA, believe it or not, gave a great deal of money to the exhibition, to abstract expressionism, because they put all sorts of exhibitions in all the capitals of Europe, and there's no doubt about it that it took over in the 50s and the 60s. It took over the art world, and of course it moved the center. And this is the important thing: it moved the center of the art world from Paris to New York, and it became the most important from that point of view. It became politically very important. You have to remember that the 50s was the time of the problems between Russia and America. It was the Cold War, of course, and America was concerned about it. It was actually founded by the CIA, and it was. I'm sorry, I've got a cat on my lap. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Sorry, dear, with the cat suddenly. Now I've lost my place again. Sorry, dear. Forgive me. I've got
no. Go take your time.
I'm looking for my place. I've written it all down. It was founded in the decision to promote abstract expression was in 1950, and the CIA put together an organization which was called the International Organization Division, and it was run by a man called Tom Braden, and they literally put two very important exhibitions on. One was called Masterpieces of the 20th Century, that's in 1952, and the other one was in 1953, and it was modern European modern art. And virtually every major city between 1958 and 1959 had these pictures. And this was what the CIA said about it was that they thought it symbolized American ideals, and was able to, by numerous methods, to summarize the position and the history of 20th century modernism. So we're seeing it from that point of view as a sort of a political thing, which I think is interesting. Let's put the first one on.
The spread of a national identity.
No question it worked. Okay, now here I've got this wonderful photograph of these very middle-aged white men, and these are the expatriates, the exiles, the people who fled from Europe generally, and they're all there. I mean, you've got, it was in the Pierre Matisse Gallery, it was 1942, and there's Matter, there's Zadkine, there's Tinguely, there's Ernst, there's Chagall, there's Léger, and Chalichev, and Berman, all of them sitting there, looking there. There's Ernst right in the center. And this particular photograph was in 1942. Now, Pierre Matisse's gallery was actually started, Pierre Matisse was a little earlier than this, but at this particular moment, Peggy Guggenheim opened up her important art of this century in 1942. She came to America in 1941, and she's going to come back to Europe in 1947. And at that time, another woman is going to take over most of the people she showed. But the most important thing is that, funnily enough, the two important promoters of abstract expression turned out to be, in a way, women, because one case is Peggy Guggenheim, and the other one, the other one is a dealer, is Betty Parsons. And so it's strange. This is a strange point. The point about this group is they brought to at that time a very provincial America. Most of the people that we're going to be talking about, but of course the Great Depression had started in 29, and so there was the federal, wonderful Roosevelt gave this money, the federal money, to so all the artists, as we talked about last week, they all produced work, and they were paid, and they had to produce it in 6 weeks. And so in a way it kept everybody from starving. I mean, Rothko, Pollock, all of them actually were members of this club. And so nevertheless, that it was moderately provincial. And one thing that this great number of people did when they brought the idea, the European ideas. I mean, not in this photograph, but one has to remember that Duchamp was here at this particular time, as was Mondrian. And so suddenly, New York City suddenly had this great explosion of the most avant-garde of the modernist pictures. So you're talking about surrealism, and you're talking about cubism, and you're really talking about the beginnings of abstraction generally. So this is the point. This is the back of the whole thing. Now let's put the next one on, and we can see what actually happened. Now, in the next picture at the top, you've got a Mexican painter, because you've got Sequeiros, David Sequeiros. He was born in 1896. He died in 1974. And I've put him on because the other important idea in the 30s was the success of Mexican abstract, huge mural paintings. They were always figurative, and usually they were talking about the poor. And this particular one happens to be about Mexico. Well, the reason I put it on is because at one point, Pollock worked for Sequeiros, and it was through him that he got interested in the very large pictures. Now, they're very huge. I mean, all of these Mexican murals were actually gigantic. And the picture underneath it is the first very large painting that Pollock did. And it was actually it's the Guggenheim mural. It's Peggy Guggenheim's mural, and it's 8 feet by 1 foot. It's gigantic. It was actually painted on canvas, and I believe they say we have to credit Duchamp with this idea. He came to Peggy Guggenheim and he said, "Don't put it straight on the wall, but put it on canvas." Now, when Pollock had this commission, he was living in a very, very small, tiny studio, and he had to knock walls down in order to do it completely. And this particular was the first time he did this very large thing. And if you look at it carefully, there is the sort of the background of a sort of figurative work, because the other person he worked with, apart from Sequeiros, was Thomas Hart Benton. Now, we have to remember that the Pollock comes from the Midwest. And one thing he did know, had seen as a young boy, was the indigenous Americans who did sand painting. Okay, let's have the next one. Now, this is one of the big surprises of this exhibition. And this is this extraordinary lady. And she is called Janet Sobel. Nobody had ever heard of her really before this video. She came actually from the Ukraine. She's a Ukrainian American. And she was born in 1893 and she died in 1968. And she had 5 children, and she started to paint very late in life. She was in fact 45 before she started to paint. And one of her sons thought her work was interesting, and so he persuaded her to take it more seriously. And of course, eventually, she's going to have an exhibition, of course, at Peggy Guggenheim's gallery in 1945. 46. I mean, are you surprised, really? But here she is. And what is important, she is, there's no doubt about it, she's the first person to take the paint, not use an easel, but to paint directly on the floor. And of course, it's all over painting. Now, to be fair to both Pollock and Greenberg, they did credit her with this idea. They saw her work at Peggy Guggenheim's gallery. And this is the reason that Pollock also took the painting from the easel and put it on the floor. Now, the picture on the right you see is one of Janet Sobel's pictures, and it's called the Milky Way, and it was painted in 1944. And you see what she actually did. Not only did she sort of have this all over painting, which was very important, but she sort of dripped and had all sorts of sticks and goodness knows what. And the surface, therefore, is very interesting. Next one shows, of course, Jackson Pollock. And this was a photograph that eventually was in Life magazine. But this is him in 1944 in the Springs in Hampton, as doing the all over pictures. And there's no doubt about it. Sobel has been written out of art history. She's only recently been discovered or talked about. And this is Pollock who's been given the credit for this particular way of painting. Now, this is very important because one of the most important things about this particular way of painting is that, one, it's an action painter, and later on, Rosenberg is going to give the title of abstract expressionism to it. I have to back a minute. The important thing about this, you see, is, as I say, it's an all-over painting. And when they became very large, they did give a sort of a universal. I always, when I first saw Pollock, I used to think it was almost like the universe. It was an image of the universe. They were not terribly interesting in that point of view. And of course, they're tremendously thick because they were literally painted. Paint was dripped, as you know, but from above and walking round, you see. So the artist almost becomes involved in the whole of his body, becomes involved in making the picture because he walks all the way around the piece when he's doing it. The next two show you two more of Sobel's pictures. This one on the left is called The Burning Bush, and this was an early one. This is about 43. And the other one is The Vision of Solidity, which is 45. Both of these are in the exhibition, so you can actually see these, and they are very interesting. Again, the people on Tuesday were seeing, and they were right, of course, they were seeing sort of figurative images, and the one on the left, you can see faces and so on, and very much as the Guggenheim one of Pollock's was. Okay, let's have the next one. Now, here we have Lee Krasner. Now, Lee Krasner was actually a Jewish girl, but she was really called Lena. Now, one thing you're going to notice of all the painters we're going to be talking about who exhibited with this particular group, they made their names masculine. She was never called Lena. She changed her name to Lee. It could be therefore a male. And eventually that you're going to find all of them are going to do this. The top right-hand picture, of course, shows she and Pollock in the East Hamptons. And the picture on the left is one from the exhibition. It's called The Bald Eagle of 1955. And the lower part is a detail from it. Now, again, she was a painter when they first met. They met in 42. They married in 43. And, he actually, as you know, he knocked himself, killed himself really by going into in a car, driving with his mistress and his mistress's friend. The friend survived, the mistress didn't, and neither did he. I mean, he really was. I mean, he died in 1956. And she was a serious painter and was showing before she met him, but she didn't ever give any sort of, somebody admit, she didn't ever have any success until his death. Now, the next one is very, very interesting. This particular group, this is what you can see in the exhibition, and it's absolutely interesting. And this one is called Bald Eagle, but interestingly, it's a collage. That in itself is fascinating, but the method was interesting. In 1950, I think it was 1952, 53, she got distressed about the work, probably because she was getting nobody was interested in her work. She started to tear it up, particularly all her drawings, and she threw them all over the floor. And of course, when he died, she's continued to live in the East Hamptons and used his studio in the barn. And as you see here, you can see that these particular images on the picture come from old drawings, as here, which is what this is the painting, and these two are details from it. It's an interesting thing. They're very the thing that we're going to look at next is very interesting. Now, this is the first time that the abstract expressionism, the abstract expressionists became a group, and they should really be called the New York School, because in fact there's no doubt this particular group of artists, they all lived very close to each other in the 9th Street area. And it's, as we saw last week, not very far from, it's actually Greenwich Village, but it's quite close to Harlem. And they could get very, very cheap places to live. And most of them, they were all incredibly poor. And some of them were almost virtually starving. And this particular exhibition, they got together, and it was a broken down building, and it was going to be destroyed. And so for $70, actually, they hired this space. And Leo Castelli, actually, who was later on going to have his own, of course, and much later on, this about 5 years later on, this is going to have his own gallery. But this is the first time he curates a show, and he actually paid for it in the end, because they were so poor. They all put sort of $1 in or something, but they didn't have enough to actually use it. And the artists themselves painted and decorated it. And what you see here in this part, this is the interior. Now, this picture on the left is very interesting. This is Elaine de Kooning's painting of Leo Castelli. It was painted in 1954. This all took place in as you see, in 1951. And it was not that this particular exhibition lasted for 20 days, I think. And nobody sold anything. They didn't expect to. But what it did do was to excite all the critics, Greenberg, Rosenberg. And it was the beginning of the group. In the top right, you can see the people who actually took part. With 74 people actually took part in this exhibition, but actually only 64 were pointed. And this particular, the particular thing was done by Klein. And the top here is where it was the bar, their local bar. That, of course, is the Cedar Bar. Now, the Cedar Bar in this particular area, this whole area was very run down. And it was a sort of, if you can think about sort of as the East End used to be, it was sort of entirely, the bar was really occupied by sort of working people, and specifically people who worked in the docks, the dock laborers. And this was taken over by these particular artists because the beer was cheap. And this particular Cedar Bar became one of the most important places where they all met In this time it was women too. Now, from this group, they got together and they had something they called the club. Now, this was very important because what they tended to do in one or another studio, they used to go and get together and talk. If they weren't talking in the Cedar Bar, they were talking in this particular club. The problem was both de Kooning and Pollock were alcoholics. In fact, Pollock was thrown out of the Cedar Bar because he broke down one of the doors. He wasn't allowed to come back again. Okay, next one. He was a very violent drunk. Now, this is very interesting. These two pictures are by Elaine de Kooning. Now, Elaine de Kooning, Elaine, again, they'd met in the 40s, and she was again a painter. And of course, Wilhelm de Kooning was, of course, a Dutchman. Now, the picture on the left is Elaine's painting of Wilhelm. And very interestingly, the one on the right is, of course, de Kooning. And in the 1950s, de Kooning suddenly took on, by this time he had a big reputation, and he took on his women's series. And this one is The Woman of 1952. And it is, Elaine later said, if he could paint women, I could paint men. And so we're going to see her pictures of men. One of the interesting things about her pictures of men is the way she sits them on a chair. And the center of the painter is the crotch of the man. You see it in all of the pictures like this. Now, Elaine de Kooning and Wilhelm de Kooning had a long marriage, but their marriage was, they literally slept around, both of them. And it broke down for a long time, but eventually it came together. They again had moved to East Hampton from New York, and she was with him. She went with him to the end of his life. She died first, actually. Next two. Now here are her lovely paintings of the men, and I think they're absolutely wonderful. They're all artists, or critics. The first one is a man called Michel Sonneband, and he was a painter. And then one in the center is important. This is Harold Rosenberg. And there's no doubt that she had a long relationship with him. And of course, the one on the right you'll all recognize, and this is Kennedy. This was painted in 1963. So we've got 51, 54, and 63. And the reason that the Kennedy one looks so unfinished is because he refused to pose for her. And so she had to actually keep on painting him when he was having conferences and talking to other people. And this particular one, she did it several times, but this particular one, I think, comes from the National Portrait Gallery. But it is a lovely one. Okay, next one, because this is more of her dad. This is fascinating. The one on the left, she became very interested with the dancers. And this is Merce Cunningham. And this is again this actually is later. This is 1962. And the one in the center you'll be interested in, this is Robert De Niro, not the actor, but his father. This is Robert De Niro Sr., who was a painter, and he was one of this 9th Street gallery. His work was, as did the one on the far right. And this is Fairfield Porter, another artist, and this is 1954. And this is Elaine de Kooning putting her stand down and saying, if he can paint women, I can paint men. Now here you've got the lovely Elaine de Kooning's pictures from the exhibition. And the one on the right, which is very interesting, is called The Bull. Can you see? Can you see the head of the bull here? And the one on the left is just called Abstraction, number 3. And that was painted in 1959. It's oil on canvas. And the bull is acrylic. I didn't realize it, and also collage. I didn't realize it, but acrylic was relatively new. Now, the important thing about the acrylic, again, I didn't really know about this, is that it could be watered down, literally watered down with water. Whereas if they wanted to make the oil paint thinner, they had to use turpentine. And so it was much easier to use acrylic from that point of
I
view.
think
When-
acrylics were also cheaper.
They
were they
probably,
not?
I think they possibly were, really. I'm not absolutely sure about that, about what the price of them. Now, the next one we're going to see is a lady who has been completely forgotten. And she was called Grace Hartigan. She was born in 1922 and she died in 2008. And she really comes, they call, from the second generation of the abstract expressionist. She's part of the group of Joan Mitchell and Frankenthaler. And she actually was part of this group, a very active part, but she moved from New York and she went to Baltimore, and for some reason or another, she's not known. Very interestingly, when she was showing or trying to show her work as a young woman, she changed her name from Grace to George. And so she was called George Hartington because they literally would not put the pictures usually they wouldn't female pictures. There's something I forgot to tell you about Lee Krasner, and I must remember, because when I was creating this lecture, I was looking for dates, and I used the Pelican Dictionary of Art, the famous one, the Oxford Dictionary of Art. And I looked up Kirchner, and you know what it said? For Kirchner, look Pollock. And sure enough. And
For Krasner.
Krasner, sorry, I'm saying Kirchner. I meant Krasner. I'm sorry, I said Kirchner. I meant Krasner. It said, can you believe, Pollock? And sure enough, big article about the life and so on of Pollock. And about 3 or 4 lines saying, and by the way, he was married to Lee Krasner, and Lee Krasner's dates as well. Isn't that extraordinary?
No mention of her as an artist.
No mention of her at all. Okay, next one. I think this is so extraordinary. This is
Well, they're your middle-aged white man.
I'm afraid you're right. This is Joan Mitchell. She was born in 1925 and she died in 1992 in France. She's much better known in Europe than she is in America because she spent most of her life. She went to Paris for the first time in the early time, in the 28. She was an again, she came from a good family. She had enough money to do that. In 1949, she came back to New York and she became the part of this second exhibition, I think. But she's got 2 paintings. She was picked up then. She had 2 paintings of the Whitney and MoMA in 1958. These particular ones, the one on the left is called Rufus Rock. It's very beautiful. And you see, she has, in this case, it's acrylic. And you see the painting, she's made the paint very, very thin. You can see
the way it drips
down here. There's a detail here. And the one on the entire right is called Untitled, and that's much earlier. This is 1957 and this is 1966. She actually died in France and she came to Paris. Eventually she moved outside Paris and she actually lived in one of Monet's ex-houses. And there's no doubt she was very interested in the way that Monet literally painted. Okay, next one. She's an interesting one. Now here we have perhaps the most earliest successful one. And this, of course, is Helen Frankenthaler. She was born in 1928 and she died in 2011. Now, the important thing about she came from a totally different social class than the ones we've been looking at up to now, possibly with the exception of Mitchell. Her father was a judge, a very wealthy family. She was very well educated. She went to Bennington, one of the great female universities, and then she went to Columbia. And most importantly, she did an art history degree thing there, and she was actually elected by Mayor Shapiro, one of the greatest art historians of all time. So she knew her background, and she was tremendously innovative because what she did, of course, was stain the cabin. This is why I've got a photograph of her actually doing it. Now she worked again on very, very thin paint. And again, she used sometimes acrylic because it was easier, but otherwise she had to thin it down it stained into the painted.
You mean the unprepped
Unprimed
canvas?
canvas.
Unprimed canvas.
Unprimed canvas. Now the picture on the right I've put on just because it's by Robert Motherwell, who turned out to be a very important figure in the abstract expressionist group, particularly because he was the most, again, like her, he was very well educated. He was a Harvard graduate. Again, a wealthy Jewish family, both of them very wealthy family. And they were, when they were briefly married, they didn't stay married for very long, but they were the sort of the golden pair. And this particular one is a collage of 1951. And the one on the left, we see her working in the 1950s in this way. Okay, next one. And you see this really beautiful picture, which is when you go to the exhibition, this is the one you actually go into
You
the
walk
door.
into.
You walk into, it's enormous. And as somebody said on Tuesday, and absolutely right, that it looks like a watercolor. It really does. But it also has a sort of sense. It's called April Mood, and it really is very beautiful. It's 1974. You see how big it is. A wonderful picture, this one. Okay, this is a much, much earlier one. This is her showing how she literally became the painter she was. This is called Circus Landscape. It's oil and charcoal. It's 1951. And she's been looking at Kandinsky. You can see this perfectly easily. And her own particular, much more generous style does not come until later. The one on the right is in the exhibition as well. And this is called After Rubens. And again, it's oil and charcoal. And this is 10 years later. This is 1961. She went on to be very, very, she had a reputation. She was one of the very successful ones. Of course, she was shown by Betty Parsons. Okay, next one. This one again is her. This is her. This is again in the exhibition, and we've got a detail of this one. It's called Vessel, and it's now again 1961. This is not an acrylic. This is oil, and it's on the unsized canvas, of course. And this is a detail here of the work that she really worked on this one. Okay, next one. Now this was one of my most the ones I personally like very much. She's called Vivian Springford. I'd never heard of her. She's born in 1913, and she actually died in 2013. And she was associated with the abstract expressionists in the 1950s and the 60s. She studied at the Art Students League, and she made her life as a commercial illustrator. And she took to abstract art, but she was very interested by calligraphy. She stopped painting in the 1980s because her sight failed, and so she ended up blind. But I think they're really very beautiful, this one. But I didn't know her at all. Okay, next, of course, American. Now we're moving a little bit because this is an English woman. This particular picture here is Gillian Ayres, and these pictures of Gillian Ayres. She was born in 1930, and she died in 2018. And she went to Camberwell. She was in Camberwell in 46 or 50, and she showed it. This is a photograph of her at the top there about that time, and she showed it the Young Contemporaries. She actually was picked up by the London group in the 50s, and she became really very important. She in 1963, again, the Whitechapel gave a very, very big exhibition of the English abstract expressionists, and she was in that in the early 60s. And I got a quotation from, she said, "I want art that's going to make me feel heavy in a high-flown way. I love the idea of that." And this is her picture here on the right. This is 1977, and this one, Break Off, is 1961. This is the sort of thing you see her painting at the top. And of course, she used again this triptych. Okay, next one. And here, it's this particular one on the next one is Gillian Ayres again. And this is called Distillation of 1967. And the other one, these are both in the exhibition. And the one on the right is called Sun Up, and this is 1960. And she had a really strong, spontaneous feeling about it, really. She had one big successful thing. She did a mural in Southampton High School, which I haven't seen, but I believe it's still there. She lived and worked in London. Okay, next one. Now, this is the second important English artist, and she's called Sarah Blow. And she was very interesting for another interesting reason. She was born in 25, she died in 2006, and she was one of the pioneers. She went to St. Martin's and the Royal Academy, but she taught at the Royal Academy, at the Royal College. And she taught, actually, believe it or not, hockey and guitar. Now, I think that's interesting. Her work is tremendously interesting in terms of its surfaces. This is the painting, and these two are from Camilla, and you can see the fact she's put sand in,
like aggregates.
Aggregates, all sorts. Very strong picture, this one. She's very interested in Sandra Blow. Now, the next one is going to be this is one of her paintings. This was not in the exhibition, it was one I found. And it gives you the sense of surface that she's so interested in. Okay, next one. Now, this is perhaps one of the most interesting people of all time. She's called Betty Parsons, and she was a rich lady, upper class, rich woman. And she started off, she wanted to be a painter, and she comes from a very wealthy group of family. And she was born in 1900, and the family had 3 children. And she spent her young life between New York and Paris and Palm Beach. And for a while, she was interested in she saw the Armory show and got interested and decided she wanted to be a painter. She wanted to study art. So she went to Paris. She married briefly in 1919 to a man called Schuyler, and he was a socialite, but it didn't last very long. I think she was lesbian. But the important thing about her is that she was the most interesting of all of the gallerists. She worked when her marriage broke down, she came back to New York, and she worked in various galleries. And eventually she started one of her own. And you see it's on 15 East Street. Now, this is 1951. This is her opening gallery. And in the center, you've got this very interesting photograph of the 3 people she was showing. And one is Barnett Newman, and there's Jackson Pollock and Tony Smith. You really can't do better than that, can you? She was the one who literally showed the women again and again when nobody else would. Look at that. She herself was a painter. Next one, we'll see her work. I mean, I'm not saying she was a great painter, but she was tremendously interesting. I'm going to quote Frankenthal, what she said about her. She says about her, and she said she met her in 1950. And this is what she says. Betty and her gallery helped construct the center of the art world. She was one of the last of her kind, which I think is lovely of her. She was a very interesting woman. She had a summer place where she lived with another woman. And these pictures she did in her summer place. This is Blue Field, 1957. And the other one is just called Looking One. And it's also 1957. They're both oil on canvas, these two. It's very interesting. Now, the next person I'm going to talk about, I really, in a way, should have put him on earlier. I said at the beginning that you have to remember that behind abstract expressionism was an interest, of course, in surrealism and so on, but this particular man was tremendously important. He's called Hans Hofmann, and he taught and until 1958. Now, he came from Germany, of course, and he came to America in 1930, and he started to work, and for a while he worked in other universities, but he actually started his own sort of studio. But most importantly, he had one in New York and he had one in Provincetown, and virtually everybody that we've been looking at some point or another was trained by him. Now, he was very, very interesting. He himself did not start painting until he gave up teaching. So the picture on the right is quite late. It's called Pompeii, and it's 1959. Now, I'm going to try and explain why he was so important. He was the first person to talk about the surface of modern art. And he is famous for saying, you have to have a push and you have to have a pull. And the push meant that whatever shapes, and he did it entirely coloristically in terms of dimensions. And these pictures, the push ones are on the surface and the pull ones underneath are the other colors. He was enormously important in terms of influence. But he did say, he was one of the persons who actually said what people thought about women artists. When he saw some work of Lee Krasner's, he said it's good enough to have been painted by a man. Okay, next one. Now, there's another, perhaps the third most important figure, coming from abroad, of course, was Gorky. The top left here is Ashil Gorky. And he was born actually in Albania. And it was taken over by Turkey. And he went on the famous walk with his mother. And he ended up in Russia. He changed his name, his first name. I haven't written it down because I couldn't really pronounce it. He changed his name to Gorky, the writer, and he came to America. He came to America in the 1920s. He emigrated, and he very, very sadly, he was one of the tremendously important influences. Of course, he's picking up from Kandinsky and so on. He's the first person to do this kind of work, and sadly, he committed suicide. He was born in 1904 and he died in 1948. He was enormously important to do the upcoming paintings of the time, particularly the woman on the right. She's from the exhibition. I'd never heard of her at all. She's called Ethel Schwanbacher, Schwabbacher, born in 1903, died in 1984, German American. And she actually was actually a student of Gorky's. She worked with Gorky for a while, and the picture on the right, which she was a private studio, and this particular one on the top right is hers here, which is untitled. And these two underneath are Camilla's details. And her imagery was very, very much influenced by Gorky. She is in the exhibition. Gorky, of course, is not. Okay, next one. Now, this lady, I think is very interesting. She's called Charlotte Park, P-A-R-C. She's born in 1918 and she died in 2010. She's again in America. And she was very, very close to Krasner and Pollock. And she moved to East Hampton. She was married to a man called Brooke. Both of them were in the first Studio 9 exhibition. And her work is very interesting, it's very strong. This is Jubilee, and this is a detail from it. But the picture on the right is not in the exhibition. and that is called Blue Warning, and that's 1953. That's 53, and this is 55. So we're still talking very, very early. These are the beginning. The point about it, this is a first generation abstract expressionist. Again, completely unknown. Next one. This one I found her work was fascinating. She's got a funny name. She's called Buffy Johnson. She was born in 1912 and she died in 2006. She was in Paris and she became tremendously interested in surrealism. And eventually she spent her life long, she was a writer as well, and she was a sort of historian, but a rather romantic historian. She was always looking for the great goddess, the imagery of the great goddess. And she spent her entire life doing this. And it was published finally in 1958. But she also moved to East Hampton. And so there was a sort of an artistic group, of course, Krasner and Pollock were there, the main figures. And this particular picture is called Pentecost, and it's 1958, and this is the detail of it. Okay, you see how many of these are completely unknown. This is another relatively unknown woman. She's called Judith Godwin. Now, if I'd had more time, really, I found her very interesting because she was associated with Hoffman. She was actually taught by Hoffman. She was very much interested in music and dance, and she was very associated with the Martha Graham dance group. And so her pictures are really, really influenced both by music and dance. And the one on the left, this one here, is called the Black Cross, and it's 1959, and this is a detail. This is a much better, this is the real thing. And the other one is the Black Pagoda, and again, this is a detail. I liked her work very much. It was very much like Klein. I liked this black when I saw it. She was, I think, very interesting. They were talking, these are 58, 59. They're very early. Okay, next one. Now, this is the interesting thing about these people. They are tremendously early. I mean, this woman, for example, I had never, ever heard of, and yet she was one of the very, very first. She's called Mary Abbott. She was born in 1921. She died in 2019. And she was working in this way very, very early. She was one of the first of the abstract expressionists. And she set up in 1946. She set up her own studio, and she spent the rest of her life really as a teacher. She had a studio in Tedder Street. And the picture on the left is the purple crossover of 1959, and the other one on this side, which is it's very difficult to see it here. In fact, in actual fact, it's very strong. I remember this one clear. I mean, I've got it in an idea of it in my head still, and it's a collage. It's oil and canvas, and it's 1955. I mean, very, very. She was very lush colors. She spent a lot of her time in Haiti. And she was therefore involved with rather strong, sort of very strong natural colors. And so she lived off in the 50s. She used to spend a lot of her time there. So she lived on and off there and New York. Okay, next one. Now this lady I liked a lot. She's called Yvonne Thomas. She's a French American, born in France, 1913, died in the USA in 2009. And she, again, was first generation abstraction. She left France in 25, and when she came to America, she studied at the Cooper's Union, and she took place in this ninth group, this nice street. And but she always maintained her interest in Europe, and was very much involved in the in the French version of abstract expression, in which they called art informal. And this is Transformation of 1956, oil on linen, and the other one is Exploration of 1956. I like her colours. Her colours are very subtle, I think. Okay, next one. Now, this is a lady called Pat Pasloff, born in 28, died in 2011. Now, again, she's very, very much associated with the Black Mountain School. Do you remember we talked about this a little while ago? This Black Mountain School was in the Carolina, and one of the people who came there to teach, Albers was there, of course. He was the most important figure, and he brought all the ideas from Europe, and of course, eventually he came to Yale. But in this particular moment, when she was there, de Kooning was one of the part-time teachers, and she became very interested in de Kooning's work. And when she came to England, back to New York, she worked a lot with him. And this one is called Stove. It's 1959, and this is a detail. And the title of the next one is rather odd. It's called Promenade for a Bachelor, 1958. And her line, if you look at the way that the actual paint is applied, it is very like de Kooning. Okay, next one. Now this one was very strange. This lady was very, very strange. She's called Sonia Geshoff, and she's born in 1926. And she used a palette knife. And she actually came from Philadelphia. She went to the same school that Bill did, the Pennsylvania Academy. But she actually is not a New York artist. She comes from San Francisco. And she went down to San Francisco and started there a group and was very much involved with it. But she found that San Francisco was a much nicer place to live than New York. She came up to New York and she found them very, very anti-female, she says. And she thought the San Francisco were much more interested in women than the New York artists. The first one is called The Map. It's very early, and it's 1958. It's oil on canvas. And she said of them, they were all misogynists. And this is a detail of it. You see the extraordinary, it does look like a cross, doesn't it? And the one on the right is called The Queen. And that's 1958, very strong. She used a palette knife. Okay, next one. Now this lady is fascinating. She called her real name, her actual name was Corinna, but she called herself, she was called Corinne West, but she knew that she felt she'd never been shown if she had a female name, so she called herself Michael West. Now her background is very interesting because she died completely unknown, absolutely unknown. She was born in 1908 and she died in 1991. And she actually came from Cincinnati. She actually showed a lot of work. The middle one is called Nihilism, and the other one is Narcissus. And this is 1947, her working in her studio. Now, the interesting thing of this, she said, she'd been, I'm quoting, the artist born Corinne Mitchell West might have been forgotten entirely, save by a chance encounter in a hospital thrift shop in Westchester County. It was there in 1989 that Stuart and Roberta Friedman encountered one of her works, completely unaware of her bona fides as a pioneering first abstract expressionism. And they actually finally find out where she is. That they bought the painting, and they tried to find her. By the time they found her phone number in the Yellow Pages, she'd already died. and she had neither will nor heirs. Her estate, the Friedmans soon learned, was being auctioned by the city. The couple were not major art collectors, but they took the plunge and purchased some 110 paintings on canvas and 500 works on paper and various photographs. And they spent something like $1,000, they said. And they stored the archive in their Westchester garage for over 28 years. And then when they started Taggart, shown by a gallery called Taggart, and of course her work is now worth thousands. It's an interesting background. Okay, next one. And this one I liked enormously. And she actually is Austrian. This lady is Austrian. She's called Lily Fenichel, 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 born 1927, died 2016. Came to America after the Nazis entered Austria. And again, she went to California, and she worked always. She actually got a fine arts degree, and she became really a gestural abstract painter. And the Untitled, they're early. This is 1950, and this one is ochre, red, and blue. They're both 1950. They're big, big images. Okay, next one. Now, this lady is interesting because she is Japanese. There's a photograph of her in her studio, which I managed to find. And she was born in 1913 and 1991. She was a Japanese artist, and she was both pre-war and post-war. But she came to America she moved to Paris in 1956, and she went to New York in 1958, and then saw the work of the abstract expressionists. But what is interesting about her work, that it's painted over crinkled paper on canvas, and it's called washi paper. And the actual paint, so it's sort of three-dimensional. Can you see this a little bit from this one here? And it's oil on paper, really, on top of canvas. She went back to and died in Japan. And she became very, very successful in Japan, and she never came back to America again. And again, she used acrylic in this case on canvas, because of course the water was important. And the work here was, again, this one was just called Work, and it's 1959. Her work was very interesting. Now here we actually see one of my favorites, and this is when you find them beginning to use all sorts of other materials than paint. They mixed sand and all sorts of things. She's called Joanna Francis, and she's Spanish. She was born in 1924. She died in 1990. She lived near Alicante and then finally in Madrid. And she got interested in art informal, the French version, in the 1950s. And she formed a group in 1957. She's interesting, monochrome palette always, with a black sort of grey and beige, and dripped and scratched and sometimes torn. And she mixes earth and all sorts of things in her pictures. And this is number 8, this particular one here of 1958. And the other one is number 1949, and that's 1960. So this is 2 years later. And you can see the next one you'll see, Camilla's taken wonderful details of them. You actually see what they're made of. Aren't they marvelous details? They're acrylic and soil on canvas and all sorts of things, straw. Aren't they interesting? They're like three-dimensional. You like these things, you actually.
Because they were sort of built up.
They were
the
very
surface
beautiful.
And very tactile. So they kind of invited you to step forwards and take a look, and then kind of take a step back and kind of really interact bodily with the piece.
As I say, she sort of scratched and did all sorts of things on the canvas of these. Okay, next one. These are very interesting. This was one of my favorites. I like this woman very much. She's called Sarah Grillo. She was from the Argentine, and she came to New York she was born in 1919, died in 2007, and she came to New York in 1962, and she couldn't speak the language, and she was fascinated by graffiti. And it was this particular picture I like very much. It's very big. It's a diptych. It's very, very big. And it's called Not Even One More Day. And it's 1966. And it literally is her journey walking around New York and seeing the graffiti. And of course, she is going to influence Basquiat. Isn't that interesting? The next one I'll show is a detail. There's a detail, and here's a Basquiat. This Basquiat, of course, was 1980. And this is called 50 Cent Piece. And poor man, he died of heroin overdose when he was something like 22 or 23 or something. He was picked up by Warhol and he became very popular. But there's no doubt about it. He was looking at the graffiti work of this lady. She's interesting. Okay, next one. Now here we have a woman called Maria Helena Vieira da Silva. And again, Portuguese. And she went to France and she died in France. And she's part of this group who are kind of art informal. When on this side, it's called the Naval, and that's 1956. The one on the left, the one on the right, that was not in the exhibition, but the one on the top was. And that's a real picture from Camilla's photographs. But look at the detail. It's fascinating. Looks like, almost like pointillism, doesn't it? It's very interesting. And she became a leading member of this sort of art informal group. And she moved to Paris. She moved from Paris and she went to Brazil. And she became very, very important there. No, these I loved. I'm not sure that you were so fond of them, but I like these ones. I thought.
No, I did. I like them
She's
too.
Chinese. This lady's Chinese. She's called Chin Yi. She was born in 1949. I don't know whether I think she's still alive. She's Chinese and she came to America, so she's Chinese American. She came to America on a scholarship to study in 1947 at New York University. And she worked, interestingly, she worked for the United Nations for a while. She worked for the Congo, got interested in African art a bit. And it sort of inspired her art, and she got very interested in this. She was also interested in calligraphy. They're very, very beautiful in a strange way. This is called Reminiscences of 1964, and the other one is called Solids, and that's both 1964. And she began to experiment in the 50s. And she got this sort of loose brushwork, which is very interesting in her work. Now, the next one is one of the people who are mixing everything in the things. She's called Marta, Minuin, Minuin. She was born in 1943, and she lives and works in the Argentine. In the 60s, she was in Paris, and so she was involved with Nikki Sanfar and Chris from Rosenberg. I forgot to mention something important that she again, she's very interested in the mixture of stuff. You can see these are detailed from them. It's sand and shellac and chalk and carpenter's glue. And she was very interested in happenings. So we're talking, she's later, you see. And we're talking, we're in the 60s really. And very urban. There's no doubt about it. There's kind of the beat movements really now. They're much, much more forward. Okay, next one. And this one is Naomi Benedetto, and she was 1930. She's also Argentinian, and she was interested in gestural abstraction. But the important thing is she put everything on the canvas. She's one of the people that stuck material and all sorts of things. And she took part in the International Exhibition of Modern Art in Buenos Aires, and she actually has always lived in Brazil. And the detail is from Camilla, and you actually get a sense of this, again, this three-dimensional sense of this work, which is absolutely fascinating. It's very difficult when there's so much there to see. Now, this lady is one of my personal wonderful favorites. She's called Toni Otaka, and she's Japanese. Well, she lives in Brazil, so she's Japanese Brazilian. And she actually was a painter, and she went to in 1936. She left Japan to visit her brother in Brazil, and they stayed there, and suddenly the wars came, and so she never really went back to Japan. And she became a painter and a sculptor. I think she's very interesting. She married a Brazilian, and she had two sons, and both of them are architects. And it was the sons really who were pushing her. And this one is untitled 1960, and this is Roscoe Purple. But what is fascinating is that she became interested in sculpture, and she was very, very interested in public sculpture. These two are public sculptures, which I found photographs of, and I thought they were lovely. She really was involved in the International Biennale, but aren't they lovely? Look at this one. You can see these sculptures which she did, and she's absolutely fantastic. She died in 2013. She's very well known in Brazil. Now the next one is going to be Korean, and she's called Ki-young Choi, and she actually lived. She came to America in the 60s, and she had a very short career. She died at 45, and she was born in 1940. And she was interested in formal art, as you can see. And this is the picture, and these two are Camilla's details. It gives you an idea of the quality of the paint. Many of them by this time are using sort of palette knife, not necessarily paint, you see. It's moving, it's changing. Okay, next one. This one is fascinating. She's called Nadia Salaki, and she was born in 1936. And she went to work in France. She's Lebanese. But of course, she got very, very caught up when she tried to go back to Lebanon. She got caught up in the war, and she returned to France, and she's lived in France for the rest of her time. Her work is very interesting. It's 1960. It's got all sorts of strange things. It's got silver and gold in it. Interesting work, this one. Next one. There you are. We're nearly actually this time. We're nearly actually at the end. And this lady is Nadia Saikal. She's also Lebanese. Interesting work, this one. And this is Gestures of 1960, and the Moonrise is 1961, which I think is lovely. She's using the sort of staining quality that Frankenthaler used, as you can see. Okay, next one. Now this one, I gather, she's called Francesca Temerson, but she actually created these, believe it or not, by throwing these images onto canvas, onto straight on paper, and they're very, very straight. She worked in the cinema, and in 1938 she was in Paris, and she designed for the theatre. And she lives in England, or she did when she was alive. And this is a sort of made of emulsion and black enamel and silver enamel, very, very strange stuff. And I gather she was tremendously involved with the informal group as well. She again was a Japanese painter and printmaker, and she and her husband Temerson started a very avant-garde publishing house, and she lived in New York in 1960. And the one on the right is a Japanese. I've put it in because it's a lithograph, and again, it's a Japanese Tokyo Shinoka, and this is a lithograph of 1976. Okay, next one.